Welcome to Oh What a Lovely podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshall. Joining us for this episode is Scott Poole. Scott teaches courses in American politics and popular culture at the College of Charleston and is the author of Wasteland, The Great War and the Origins of Modern Horror. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the title of your podcast, by the way.
That's Chris's idea.
It's the one idea that I've ever had that actually has some form of transferable use to it.
It's quite good. And I think actually for Americans, not necessarily for you all, but for Americans, I think it might be a bit of a deep cut in some ways that, you know.
So, Scott, what I find fascinating, you focus on horror with books like Monsters in America, Mountains of Madness, H.P. Lovecraft's biography, Dark Carnivals, which came out last year. But what I was interested in, what inspired you with Wasteland to consider how the First World War intersected with the horror genre?
There's kind of two things. I think that, first of all, it's just kind of a lifelong interest, just kind of a vocational interest in some ways, and the war itself, particularly, I think, the effects of the Great War as opposed to primarily or only the military history. Secondly, though, there is in the literature about the horror film and about horror culture in general, there are these sort of tidbits that you find about the influence of the Great War. A lot of focus, of course, on the greatest hits. Nosferatu gets a lot of attention. Jacques to some degree, the career of Lon Chaney to some degree as well. But what I had noticed is that although there are these sort of frequent mentions, that I really couldn't find the book that brought them all together. And I think that one of the things that my North Star in making decisions about what I want to work on is, I'd really like to read a book like like that. So why don't I write a book that's kind of like that, because there's a sense in which I feel like I think my partner would probably agree. My writing is kind of like this weird hobby as much as it is a professional endeavor. So I think those things, coming together is a lifelong fascination with what the Great War meant and trying to untangle that, combined with being a monster nerd since I was a little kid,
So if we argue if you argue that the true wellspring for modern horror genre can be traced back to the First World War, we do have writers before the First World War writing horror. We have Bram Stoker and Poe. So does the First World War prove to be a rupture for the horror genre? Does something change with the genre with the First World War?
I think that there is a transformation in the meaning of horror. One of the things I think that there sometimes has been, I think I've noticed this more with maybe reviewers that, let's say, didn't read the book very closely. There's not the suggestion that before 1914, there was not an interest in the supernatural or an interest in horror. The idea is that there's a transformation of that tradition, that it does become, for lack of a better word, really very politically focused, very much an expression not only of sort of collective trauma, which you hear a lot, but also an effort to put that, not just to kind of express anxiety and terror about the times and the experience and the suffering and the death, but also to place that in a political context of some kind. And there's different versions of this. When Abel Gance makes Jacques, originally the 1919 version is barely an anti-war statement. In fact, it's more of a we should all really fight harder kind of thing. By the 1930s, it has become a film that's suggesting the depravity of war and the degradation of war. So I think that this is what changes, and I think it also gives a new meaning to the word horror and to the idea of horror itself. It was not a widely used word. It was not a widely used term in the context that we use it before the Great War. No one, for example, would have referred to Poe as a horror writer, possibly a weird a writer of the weird, a writer of the supernatural. Horror is, I think, kind of purposefully, in all meanings of the term, a much more visceral word. And it is related to people who found themselves, human beings who found themselves living with the dead and the dying on a daily basis for years in a way that I think was sort of outside the human experience. So I think it does, while it doesn't create certainly the idea of, the supernatural in popular culture, it changes its meaning. It gives it much more of a political meaning. And that's what the book is trying to unpack.
What I find interesting about this shift, and even before I get into that, when you were talking earlier on about kind of the idea behind creating the book, I remember when I first saw it got advertised online, and my initial thought before I'd even read it, it's God, what a great idea for a book. I have made my review before I've read it. It's a great idea for a book, and therefore I assume it'll be a good book. But about the this kind of conceptual shift around horror before and after the war, which I find quite interesting, is because I imagine you take something like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, it's a book very much about, the dangers of what could be. We've got all this weird technology coming on, what could this be used for? Whereas after the First World War, it seems like you get a lot of horror about this is what it was used for. It's about what we've done rather than what we could do.
I think that you see that in the way in which the Frankenstein story itself changes. Frankenstein, of course, has been maybe more popular as a dramatic stage presentation than as a novel, through most of the 19th century. And it had always had a bit of groove to it, that was obviously just very much a part of the story. I think, though, that when James Whale, British veteran of the Great War, when he makes Frankenstein in 1931, when in some ways he kind of makes sort of a remake of Frankenstein more than a sequel in 1935 with Bride of Frankenstein, I think that it's since we're so long separated in time, we don't really quite get how brutal that film was to 1930s audiences, that he really, really underscored. These are monsters that are made out of the parts of bodies. This is something even beyond the reanimated dead. This is something that's been patchworked together in a world that had, come to know what modern technology could do to modern weapons could do to the body. That's extraordinarily powerful, particularly coming from a director who had seen it firsthand.
And of course, they're, building on propaganda images of, the German soap factory and the reuse of the dead, which was there. But Frankenstein has its own politics. I'm just wondering what about the relationship with the 19th century Gothic that you see as occurring, which there's a very clear political message in Frankenstein, or a romantic reflection on humanity that perhaps isn't there in the Castle of Otranto or some of these, immensely popular Gothic novels. What's their role as precursors?
I think that the tradition of the Gothic novel, going back to Walpole and Castle of Otranto, is, I think that that's actually a good illustration of how the Great War changes the supernatural in literature. For one thing, I think the emphasis on not just the idea of mystery, but the idea that the dead body becomes this kind of site of reflection and of contemplation in a way that it did not in the Gothic. As you all obviously know, one of the great tricks of the Gothic was to show us a corpse that turned out to not really be a corpse, or to kill off a character that then inexplicably, in some cases, just kind of reappears in a later chapter with some kind of explanation for why they weren't really dead. Probably the most infamous example of that actually is in Anne Radcliffe. I think it's in Udolpho, where there's actually this really great scene that approaches what we might think of as horror, where she thinks that she's found this corpse in the scary Italian castle, and it just turns out that it was a waxen statue, some papist frippery and all of that kind of thing that we expect from a British Gothic novel. And think about that in relationship to this is sort of something that Hoyle, as an example, would never do, would not play that kind of shell game with viewers who had been introduced on a massive scale to actual corpses.
Are these films popular after the First World War in a way that they perhaps weren't before? Do we see sort of the genre shifting into popular culture? I'm not sure how popular Gothic horror was before the First World War.
It was seen as really problematic, particularly in America and in Britain. It had some strength, of course, in France, although going back into the 1890s, there had been the tradition of the use of the supernatural. But, it was often with the Militia and others, it was often presented as humorous, and the Merry Frolics of Satan, was the title of one of his films, almost like almost close to a kind of a magic show kind of a feeling. In the United States, I think this is interesting, and I think it this is something we can maybe discuss more. There is this kind of divergence with horror, because there's a way in which it kind of takes the First World War for horror to be accepted in American culture. There had been the weird tale, as it was called, but its popularity was very, very marginal. You alluded to the history of the supernatural before the Great War. It's interesting in thinking about Poe. His reputation kind of is on the rise, but no one's really emphasizing that he's a horror writer per se. He's really thought of as a mystery or a weird writer. Probably one of the best American horror writers of that era, Ambrose Bierce. No one really knows about him. Pulp magazines that are dedicated to horror are the least popular of the pulps. Cowboys are good, detectives are pretty great, and romances are okay. But the Weird Tales, including Weird Tales magazine, is it's out there, but it's a marginal interest. That's going to continue for a while. It actually takes, in some ways, the European experience of the Great War, European directors who are in various ways intertwined with that experience to really bring horror to the United States. And so there's a sense in which the Great War gives us Bela Lugosi, the Great War gives us James Whale, the Great War gives us Paul Linney. And so I think that just in terms of its popularity, and I think in America, even the willingness to accept it, I think that the Great War does play a crucial role.
I'm just wondering that difference between Anglophone nations and continental Europe. Is there something to do with the fact that that's where the dead lie, if you will, that for the French in particular, but also for Belgium and anywhere where the Western Front was, that's where the dead are buried and are being or have been seen and lived with by these combatants. So there, even once the war is over, there's a haunting, and Paul Fussell very famously talked about the uncanny, the unheimlich, as an important emotion to come or sense to come from the war itself.
Yes, I do think that's a very good point. I think that in the American case, it has something to do with having obviously a very, very, very different experience of World War I, seeing its meaning as very different, and simply not suffering from the Great War in the way that the other powers did in terms of loss of life and even involvement in it. Many of your listeners and you all, I'm sure, know that Americans believe that we won the Great War, and you're welcome and all of that sort of business. I think that most Americans are not aware that the U.S. really isn't involved until 1918. That it takes a good 6, 7, 8 months to actually, and also that a significant part of our involvement was bringing influenza to Europe. So what we ought to call apparently the Kansas flu.
The ghost of Marshal Foch is scratching at my window.
I think that that's part of the reason why, at first, as I mentioned in the book, you get this reaction to Caligari, and when it comes to the United States in 1921, part of it there's a and when it's shown in Los Angeles, there's this American Legion veterans organization. There's this march, that's like against it being shown, and part of that is just kind of continuing anti-German sentiment, but part of it, as you see in the reviews at the time, is references to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as a continental film and a morbid film. And one of my favorite quotes from that whole little controversy is, "Americans we are not a morbid people," and so this is it's quite literally un-American. I think that part of the rejection part of it is that it's sort of an anti-continental because it's continental, because it's coming from Europe, and there's this sort of perception that, well, that's different and that's weird in all kinds of senses. But part of that is just informed by having such a different experience of the Great War.
What's interesting about that is that Helen Brooks, who works at the University of Kent, has done various kind of bits of work on kind of horror-based plays during the kind of the interwar period, many of which have given me nightmares. So if you're watching or if you're listening, Helen, thanks again. See, and some of her writing is about the difference in England to kind of the reception of some of these horror plays that are generally then kind of brought over and performed by kind of French or Belgian actors that are apparently more kind of widespread on the continent, and then it becomes a slightly weird, different reception and thing for them in England. So it's interesting that your point in America is that this gap from continental Europe means that these are playing out in very, very different ways, where you get like a little microcosm of it in an aspect of horror on the stage in England performed by European casts.
So I think actually in the American experience, it is probably Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera that becomes kind of in 1925, that becomes kind of the first big mainstream horror film that is pretty clearly playing off themes of German expressionism and French surrealism, and alluding, at least, not being quite as direct as some later American films will be, but at least alluding to the experience of the Great War.
You mentioned earlier the different pulps. Of course, detective fiction is often seen, the golden age detective fiction is classically seen as a response to the war. And Alison Light has famously talked about it as almost a narcotic, as something comforting. So there is death, but it's a very sanitized version of death, and it's one that always has a resolution at the end, which just seems a very different approach from horror, where so I'm wondering if there's a sense of British exceptionalism perhaps in some of this.
I think that one could argue that in part because I think that one of the things that sets horror apart, and part of how I would even sort of define its modern expression, is the willingness to put on display a nihilistic ending, even in cases as with Nosferatu, where the monster dies. So do the hopes of everyone who's living and some of the heroes, and then the ending of Caligari, where one, discovers that the whole world is in a sense an asylum in a way. These kinds of endings that is very different from detective fiction, but also I think is different from the monster tales that come down through folklore that often involve certainly a frightening monstrosity of some kind, but one that there's also a hero that is all set to slay it, and the monster gets to live on. I think in the horror film after World War One, I think that is part of the reason why contemporary horror fans complain all the time about the remake fever in the horror film, but that's always been a part of the horror film tradition. I mean, horror is sort of constantly retelling the same stories over and over again.
At what point do you start to see new stories? Because a lot of the films you've mentioned are drawing on a Victorian novels and stories for their inspiration. Is there a point at which new stories of horror of the war start to emerge in the genre?
I actually think that it's almost immediate and taking place within the war, during the war itself. Jacques is such a good example of this. Just the conception of a army of the dead, essentially a zombie army, and putting that on screen in 1919, it's extraordinary. Also to think about, to put oneself in that place and time, and to consider what it would have been to have experienced the war either as either in the trenches or as a civilian, and all the horrors connected to that, and having lost loved ones, and then to see this resurrected army representing your own grief, embodying your own loss, and also terrifying. This is a really powerful idea. I think in some respects, it goes far beyond what Poe or Machen or Ambrose Bierce or others who had been willing to imagine before. So I think it's very quick. I think the vampire entering popular culture in a slightly more threatening fashion, I think is interesting. I think it's interesting to me, for example, that although clearly, as the Stoker estate made clear, clearly Nosferatu ripped off Dracula. It's also quite different. It's very different. The ending it does not end in 3 weddings and a funeral and all this kind of thing. It ends with one of our protagonists dead and the other deeply traumatized, and the Van Helsing figure being shown to be essentially useless. I mean, he just doesn't do anything at all. It seems to know what a vampire is, and that's about it. So I think the sort of dark creativity is there from the very beginning.
One of the extra kind of interesting things that I think about this kind of post-war period that comes up in your book as well is so you have, as you mentioned, kind of the idea of Jacques of like this zombie army, the army of the dead, but you also have what appear to be kind of stories and concepts of what it means to actually survive, because you've got men with ruined bodies, with prosthetics, with serious injuries, who are encapsulated in some kind of weird halfway house between being fully alive and being fully dead, which is ripe material for horror films. But the legacy of that I find really interesting, because what I ended up actually using your book for, particularly the kind of the chapters 3 and 4 which deal with this kind of body horror aspect, was for my academic Star Wars book to talk about Darth Vader, because it's pure kind of post-war cyborg, horrible burns, more machine than man aspect that is really, really interesting in that kind of post-1919, what does it mean to be alive kind of way.
I think that one thing, this sort of goes back to the question of, how how quickly did these themes in popular culture develop? I think that, again, because we've become somewhat inured to it, the introduction and the display of gore, and even sort of the idea, in a sense, that is something that could be put on display for entertainment. That's extraordinary. It's completely bizarre. That is not to say that it is without precedent, because certainly there's a literary tradition of that. There's a tradition of it in public exhibition. I talk in the book about sort of how some of these things are drawing on the traditions of the Wax Museum, and just simply putting them in a new context. But the notion of gore as entertainment, I think, is certainly something that comes to us from that period, and it is related to, well, one can see this kind of in France, the veterans known as the broken faces that one can see on the street or in one's household. What that does to not just an individual, but to cultures that have to in some way assimilate this into their understanding of the world.
It does make me wonder, when you're thinking of gore as entertainment, so many men have served, so many men have seen death and horrors. Who's consuming these films? Because they're not necessarily escapists. You would have thought, vast armies of servicemen might want to come back and watch love films.
No, I think that's such a good point. And one of the things I don't think there's necessarily a definitive answer to is, what are these films doing precisely, psychologically for veterans? Although it certainly is a phenomena, it's always interested me, and this is something I discuss in some more recent work, that veterans are coming home from the Vietnam War in the United States and enjoying the slasher film. This becomes, hugely popular, along with extraordinarily violent New Hollywood representations of Vietnam itself. I think that there may be something in that. I would not want to suggest that it's necessarily therapeutic. I think that's kind of that's often, kind of our first thought is, well, this must be in some way how they are dealing, with this reality. I'm not sure that that's the case, and I'm not sure that it's escapist either. It could be that, as was so true of so many veterans after World War I and every war, one learns to live in the violence. There's this terrible quote from this German World War I veteran that I used at the beginning of the chapter on fascism, that he says, that not only is the war not over, we are the war. We have become the war. So I think there can be a lot of things going on there, and I'm kind of not willing to just simply see it as, well, as you sometimes hear, as kind of the safety valve argument that, this was sort of a way to work through. I mean, what if it's not? What if it's a way to just kind of reenact the horror? And I think that maybe in fascism, that's some of what we're seeing.
Or adrenaline chasing was the other idea that I sort of had, of the horror and the suspense. Get a boost that you might have had at those times of war.
One of the things I know that has always probably struck you all with veterans' memoirs is, almost without exception, no matter how terrible the experience is described, there is almost, not always, but almost always some kind of expression of nostalgia for the experience. And I'm not just talking about, Storm of Steel and, things like that. I mean, like Sassoon, who obviously was just absolutely broken by his experience. Now and again, there pops up this something that feels like this nostalgia for this kind of experience, and I think that in some of the most incisive veteran memoirs, there's an awareness of this, and kind of a horror of one's own horror, a kind of a sense of, like, yes, there was something about that I found inviting And that in itself is a cause for horror.
There's a really interesting scene. This is my detective fiction. There's a fascinating scene in Dorothy L. Sayers' Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club, where George Fentiman, the very explicitly shell-shocked character, is talking about his older brother Robert, who's a regular army officer who had a good war. And George is talking about Robert shooting rats in the trench and just quite happily and sort of getting on with life, that ability to be resilient in the face of horror. And that sort of enhances George's horror at Robert's attitude. So I think you're quite right. There is in some ways the reaction and lack of reaction is at the root of a lot of feelings of horror and a sense of judgment, that if one doesn't behave in what society deems an appropriate way, what prompts disgust and fear is psychological as much as it is the visual, the visceral, the embodied that come with the disability that you were talking about with the Gueule Cassé and the others.
Yes, I think that part of my own, if I could put it this way, part of my own fascination with horror is our fascination with horror. The idea that why would I and why would we want to watch such things? And I think that there's a good argument to be made, though, along with that the very fact that this is seen as a disreputable genre, maybe the disreputable genre, that also more or less allows horror some latitude. That it did make horror very political, from its very beginnings. It's there's almost a kind of a bad kid in the back of the class kind of sensibility in the horror film that that's the horror films are, they're disgusting anyway, so they can get away with all kinds of things. And I think that's why it's continued to be very lively in terms of its sometimes confusing but also always very interesting politics.
I wonder, is there a thematic difference in works produced by those who served and those who didn't, sort of immediately in that post-war world? So I was thinking sort of James Whale has seen combat, whereas you get H.P. Lovecraft writing about the same time who hasn't.
Well, that's such a good example, in part because with Lovecraft, who is much more influenced by the Great War than I think a lot of his biographers have noticed, how he wanted to serve in the Great War, but his mother didn't let him, essentially. It is absolutely the case. He attempted to, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, which I should because it's my own book, but he attempted to join, and, maybe not surprisingly to anybody who knows anything about Lovecraft, he failed the physical. And so he then tried to join like his state National Guard, kind of like a territorial army kind of thing. His mother intervened with some, state militia colonel or something and made sure that he stayed out. It is interesting, though, that so much of what he is writing is imagining the war as a period of apocalypse and as, a period in which one can encounter monsters is kind of almost a side effect of it. The story Dagon is probably the best example of that, and one of the best examples of that. And so I think one thing I would say is that I think we have to keep in mind the degree to which obviously one did not have to be in the military to have been in the trenches to have been deeply, deeply affected by the war, to suffer from the war. If one thinks about continental Europe, one of the somewhat understudied, or at least known popularly, facts is the degree to which civilians, men and women, suffered from the Great War. Talk about this a little bit, the war in Serbia in the book, where it seems like we, have some horrific things that, one maybe connects with ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, occurring in the 1910s, and rape being used as a weapon of war. And so I think that, I think overall, I think we would have to be a little careful about drawing too bright a line between who is a veteran and who is not, and talking about, well, this and any war.
Well, I was going to move on to the modern day. Where's the First World War in modern horror?
This is one of the things that interested me. And now I do realize that in some ways this might be the phenomenon of you buy a car and suddenly everybody's driving it. But the truth is, I think that part of my interest was how some of these things lingered even as their original source is, if not forgotten, at least, there's not a very clear connection. But the fascination with gore obviously continues over into the slasher film tradition, the idea of gore as entertainment. It is certainly true that other combat experiences in the United States, the Vietnam War in particular, becomes a much more direct emphasis. Although it's also quite interesting to me how symbols of the Great War era continue into contemporary horror. The best example of this, I think, is the gas mask, which in a sense is sort of understandable that this would become a kind of a totemic image anyway, because it's insectoid, it's inhuman looking, all of this. But at the same time, it's sort of uncountable the number of times that the modern horror film has used that particular trope.
We've certainly got a theme in our reviews. Can you spot the gas mask as a dehumanizing?
Yes.
Trope?
Absolutely. And, I would not suggest that there's a direct inspiration, but I do think that it's one of the things that have carried over. Well, one of the things that I have also noticed, though, is, and I think this had something to do with the centennial, I think that there's been sort of a reintroduction of World War I very specifically into horror. Films like Trench 11, which is a Canadian film that essentially very directly uses the experience of the trenches, and almost kind of strangely in gaming and video games, there's at least two recent survival horror titles that are set in the trenches during the Great War. One in the Amnesia series, another called Ad Infinitum, I believe it's called. But in any case, again, I don't know that the creators, my sense is that they maybe don't know that they're sort of going back to their roots in some ways, but that is certainly the case.
I was going to mention the computer games and survival horrors, because for a while it struck me that this might end up being the natural kind of narrative direction for First World War computer games, of setting them in a period of time that kind of both the developers and the audience understand as being horrifying, and it allows you to use both versions of the word of horrifying for it to kind of unsettle and kind of move and scare the player by the horror of being in horror.
I've actually lost track of the number of Lovecraftian survival horror games that the protagonist is a World War I veteran, who Jessica also is a private detective, by the way. I do know of at least 3.
I was going to say there's probably been at least 2 more released since we started the episode.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And then you could go to the role-playing world, and you've got Call of Cthulhu, which is post First World War detective game with monsters. And that's
I would one of your options is certainly the backstory of your character, right? Is that I think that I know in the American context we really like to. There's 35 Lost Battalion stories, but our particular Lost Battalion, that's a real favorite as a backstory for Lovecraftian characters.
I was going to ask about zombies. Kate McDonald's argued that the cyborg was invented in the First World War. Can we say the same is true of zombies?
I think so. In terms of lingering influence, one of the things I talk about in the book is how frequently and sometimes consciously the idea from Jacques is taken up again. I think that one of the things that's striking is about the Army of the Dead notion is not just that it was used at all, but the fact that it became, kind of an essential trope in film. Certainly, we were talking about gaming, certainly in gaming. And there's a sense in which, Romero is very aware of this and in Night of the Living Dead. And I think I would also say in 2005, Land of the Dead, he's actually very pointedly thinking about zombies in both of those films as a kind of an army and a kind of a reflection of what's happening in the larger world. Vietnam in 1968, Iraq and Afghanistan in 2005. So I certainly think that that's a lingering influence, and possibly, sort of even this is in a way just a kind of I'm kind of extrapolating. In other words, I don't have any evidence for it, but it does strike me that the move of taking the zombie out of its kind of Caribbean magical context, making them an army, the idea that they always kind of come as a group, that's part of the nature of the post-apocalyptic zombie. That's an idea that obviously comes out of Jacques.
What's interesting about historical zombies, as in zombies representing historical groups, is that certainly in gaming they've been massively co-opted by the Second World War. The prevalence of Nazi zombie games where you have to shoot increasing numbers of Nazi zombies has become like a genre in itself, and I always find it kind of slightly interesting that at what point, which is the more important part of it? Is it the Nazi part or the zombie part? Which justifies the killing of them en masse? Is it, the fact that the zombies have very dubious politics, or is it the fact that these Nazis are undead? But that, for something that, has its roots in something like kind of Jacques and that period, to be fully now associated in pop culture with the Nazi zombie trope is super interesting. Adam Chapman's done some really interesting work about it.
But especially when you think about the implication of there's an element of vengeance. The dead are coming back to wreak their vengeance on the living in the Jacques formulation, which if you apply that to Nazi zombies, that's really quite troubling, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of a return of the repressed kind of idea.
They normally have like a weird tagline like hate never dies or something like that, which kind of to justify the return of, incredibly far-right undead.
I wonder, Scott, before we go, if you would like to set some homework, which is your best, if you're going to suggest a horror film to do with the First World War in the last 20 years, what would you suggest?
Most definitely fans of horror or World War I enthusiasts should most certainly see Trench 11. Again, independently produced, as much as one can have indie films today, independently produced Canadian film. It focuses on Americans, interestingly, at the very end of the war. It came out around the time the book did, and I was so fascinated that it kind of did something like what the book does in kind of bridging World War I and II, and the idea of sort of the horror of fascism being born in the trenches. You have to see the film, but it's quite literally born in the trenches, part of it. So anyway, I certainly would recommend that.
That could be our Halloween episode for next year. It's only taken us 3 years to do this one. We've managed to plan even further in ahead.
Well, it might, except that I, on principle, refuse to watch horror films. I get nightmares. I'll do Grand Guignol in the theatre, but for some reason I can't deal with film.
This is our October episode. Chris, what are we doing for November?
we're all going to Canada, where the Canadians are, for the International Society for First World War Studies conference, and presumably we'll do something while we're there.
Produce some magic.
We will be meeting in person for the first time.
I only know Angus through a tiny window.
I'm only the size of a little Lego chap. Well, brilliant. Well, thank you for your time, Scott. As I say, I enjoyed your book, and I enjoyed the audio version of your book too.
Okay, good. Very good. I'm glad to hear that. It was nice to virtually meet all of you, and I hope we talk again at some point.
Indeed. Perhaps we'll have you back and talk about Trench 11. Thank you, Scott, for your time. It's been a pleasure. That's all from us for now. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Oh.